Okay, thanks. Or Lisa, you can put them right up there again. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to TAFAF. Welcome to TAFAF Week. Welcome to TAFAF Coffee Talks. Every morning in this room at 10:30, you can come here, get a nice cup of coffee and a pastry, and be sure you're going to be listening to some great conversation about art and all associated issues with lively, interesting, expert opinions. Am I right, panel? Yes. I would like you, please, I'd like to put a plug in for this brochure, have a look at other things. We still have 2 more coffee talks tomorrow and Wednesday, and we'd love to see you for both of those as well. I'm going to introduce our panel now, our moderator, and before I get any further, one piece of housekeeping. This is, as you can see, a restaurant, and so we have a hard stop at 11:30. I'm sure you're still going to have many questions you'd like to ask this terrific panel, in which case you need to take them out into the hall, okay? So we have to, it's quite abrupt to just leave, but it's no offense intended. So we're going to get started now. I'm going to introduce, yes, I know the other piece, sorry. A little bit scattered this morning. I want to thank very much the Clark Art Institute for their help in bringing this idea forward, for their help in organizing, and for some of the wonderful people that they have helped to recruit. It's always a pleasure to work with museums, and we look forward to doing much more of that in the future. So many thanks to Clark and to all of you from Clark who have taken the trip here today to be present. Introducing Esther Bell, the Robert and Martha Berman Lipp Senior Curator at the Clark Institute, and she will be our moderator for this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linda. I'm Esther Bell. It's nice to see everyone this morning. I will be the moderator for our panel discussion today called Fingerprints in the Paint and the Expert Eye. And I have a panel here of great experts from different walks of the art world. And my hope is that today will be informal and lively at the same time, and that we'll interrupt each other with our brilliant ideas. We're all good friends up here. But today we're going to explore the types of questions that specialists might ask when poised in front of an object. So not only questions about authenticity, but questions about meaning and aesthetic quality. And we are really fortunate to have a diverse group of speakers up here, and I'm going to take a minute to briefly introduce each of them. So right next to me, I have Jon Landau, and many of you might recognize him as an American music critic, a record producer, and a manager of the incredible Bruce Springsteen. But his name is well known in artistic circles as being a prolific collector of 19th century French and English painting, Renaissance and Baroque painting and sculpture, and art collectors in the world. He is incredibly well respected as a collector, but also as a thinker, too. So we're ready to be dazzled, Jon. Next to Jon,
I can go now.
Okay, bye. No, don't go yet. Next to Jon, we have Mary Morton, who is the curator and head of the Department of French Paintings at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where she oversees one of the world's outstanding public collections of approximately 600 French paintings dating from the 17th century to the early 20th. And she oversees also a very active program of incredible exhibitions, many of which, of course, you know. She's widely published, and she has held previous curatorial positions at the J. Paul Getty Museum and also the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. She's not only a superb scholar, but she has earned the rightful reputation as a curator who has acquired excellent pictures. And so she's going to talk to us a bit about that today. Next to Mary is Jack Kilgore. Jack is a prominent New York-based art dealer who has, over the past several decades, specialized in various schools of painting, starting really with the old master, curators and collectors, and his fellow dealers alike. So that's hard to do, to have everyone like you. So congratulations. And his gallery and the stand, such as the one that he has here at TEFAF, is a place where I would say one finds surprising new discoveries. And he always displays works of the finest quality. So we'll look at a few of those pictures also today. And finally, we have Claire Berry, who for almost 30 years has served as the director of paintings conservation at the Kimbell Art Museum in Fort Worth. She is widely considered to be one of the preeminent conservators of painting in this country, and she's had a crucial hand in the meticulous treatment of many of the Kimbells and the neighboring Amon Carter Museum's signature paintings by artists such as Caravaggio, Michelangelo, and such American stalwarts as Thomas Eakins and Thomas Cole. And she has also played a pivotal role in the acquisition or helping the Kimbell execute major acquisitions, and two of which she's going to talk about with us today. So for the next approximate hour, I'm going to pose a series of questions to our speakers, but my hope is that we're going to converse with one another and that this is going to be as informal as possible. This is the most formal part, by the way. Our conversation today will touch upon meanings of connoisseurship, a word that derives from the French word connaître, which describes a person who possesses the ability to evaluate and render critical judgment about a given cultural product. And the pursuit of connoisseurship has been the plight of art historians and amateurs and collectors since the Renaissance, certainly through the 18th century and up until today. And my hope is that we will today underscore why close looking is so important and why the practice is not an archaic one, but still relevant and essential. So let's jump right on in, and I thought maybe I'd start with Jack. And Jack, will you tell us a bit about your path to the art world? So how did you become a dealer? How did you know you wanted to become a dealer? And after you tell us that, maybe tell us about one of your first discoveries.
Oh. Actually, can you hear me okay? I really didn't when I was in college, I never took any art history courses. Then when I was in law school, on one Saturday, I went to the Jolly Roger Hagel shop in Stanton, Virginia, and I saw a painting hanging on the wall of a bearded, very sour-looking. I bought this painting, but I didn't buy the painting because of the image on the front. I bought it because of the back of the painting. I was interested in antique furniture. I still have the picture, so that's kind of a
ask if
strange,
you still have it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's. But I think it's from looking at connoisseurship. Lots of times has to do with, looking at the material of how something is created, and that's how I started. This is sort of a weird. And if I hadn't gone that day to this antique shop, I don't know what would have, be doing something. I'd be a lawyer. Yeah.
Right. New York attorney. Well, Jack, I thought maybe you could tell us a bit about this painting here, which I know you were part of. It's now in the Metropolitan Museum. Yeah. It's a painting by Pierre Sublera. And can you tell us a bit about how you discovered this and your kind of path to the attribution?
Sure. It's a somewhat similar story because this painting came up for auction in Paris at Drouot. And it's a fairly large picture. And I saw it in I guess on a Wednesday morning, and the sale was, I think, maybe the next day. And there are several versions. This is a very famous composition. There's a version in the Hermitage, and there's one in the Louvre, and I think there's also one in San Francisco. There are several, and he repeated this composition. So I was trying to figure out where this fit in the sequence of this series of paintings of this subject. So looking at it, there were some very sort of minute changes, pentimenti on the picture before it went to the composition that all the other versions have, which made me think that it was the prime version of this painting. And it's not an area of French pictures, and not really something that I specialize in, but looking at the object, I could say these changes were done first, so it looks like this is probably the prime. And then I found out that there was a painting by Sublera in Vienna of his studio. And this painting with the exact same frame is in there, that painting, and he kept that picture through his entire career. So that was a way to prove that, in a sense, that this was that painting. And it was an interesting, from the object, and the painting was great, the quality was great, but there were some detective work, and then we had, a day to figure that out, so I managed to do it.
That's fascinating. So it was very rushed, but
Yeah,
you trusted your instincts, which is really important, I think. It's something I think we'll return to over and over again. Well, so this was a museum acquisition, and Mary, as a curator on this panel, I thought I'd ask you, in my intro, I mentioned that you're known in the field as having made great acquisitions, which is definitely true. And so I was hoping, would you tell us a bit about the process that you went through when acquiring this incredible 18th century picture by Jean-François Dutoit?
Sure, yeah, this actually was my first acquisition at the National Gallery in 2010, I believe. I was in Paris, and by the way, this is about double the size of the actual image. And a friend and dealer, Etienne Breton, had alerted me to a fantastic little early 18th century French painting at Eric Turquin. And so I ran over to his shop, and there was this picture in a beautiful frame leaning up against a table filled with other pictures. It's kind of, there's a lot of object traffic in that particular venue. And it was very dirty, but clearly very beautiful. So I had it checked out by a conservator in town who said it was in very good state. It looked like it was in excellent state despite the very brown varnish covering it.
So you called someone to come and look with you?
To come and look, yeah, to come and look and just make sure that there wasn't, look under UV light, and it's just always a good practice, if possible, to have a trained conservator on hand. Some curators are lucky enough to travel with their conservators. They're excellent conservators. One day I will achieve that status. Then, importantly, it was not signed. So it was listed as Jean-François Dutoit, but there was no signature. So I contacted the man who is the expert in this artist, Christophe Larabeau, who had done the catalog Raisonné.
And is now director of the Petit Palais.
Yes, he's moved around, extraordinary scholar and great museum director. And he had actually included this painting in his catalog based on a black and white photograph that he had seen in an archive. So he had never seen it. But on looking at it, said, absolutely, this is the one, this is by Dutoit. So I had to go back to the gallery, and in fact, there was a board meeting in about 2 weeks' time, and usually the gallery, it's museums move, as dealers know, rather slowly because we have to, well, if at all, it's true, but we have to be very careful about things that we bring in, and we have to do a lot of convincing up the chain of command, ultimately, of course, the board. And what I was after, of course, was not, can we buy this picture, but some kind of cap at the auction that it was going to come up with, that it was going to come up to. And so they were a little reluctant because the board agenda was already full, but I think once Rusty saw an image of this charming painting, and particularly that bull, he said, oh yeah, let's see what happens. So the board agreed to a certain cap. The price was very reasonable. And the auction happened in Senlis, outside of Paris. So I was hoping that no one else was noticing this picture. Alas, a couple of days before the sale, the Gazette de Drouot came out, and it was on the cover.
Will you explain what the Gazette de Drouot is?
The Gazette de Drouot. So they put out a magazine of the upcoming sales. I mean, there are so many sales, not only in Paris at the Hôtel Drouot, but in the region. Constantly, and so they'll sometimes do little feature articles about special things that they've seen, and there was this picture. Happily, not enough people, I think, noticed, and again, I asked Etienne to bid on our behalf, and we got it for, I would say, a song, and brought it home. It went into the conservation studio, and one of our fantastic conservators at the National Gallery is Michael Swicklick, was tasked with cleaning it. And for the first time in his career at the gallery, I think this had happened for him in his private career, but never in his career as a gallery conservator, he discovered the signature and date. Wow. And so Esther brought a detail. You can see there on the tree trunk, it says Dutoit and 1716. So that was exciting and happy, and I have a feeling that perhaps if it had been evident prior to the sale, it might have gotten a bigger price, so I was just sort of feeling good about this. Now, a few months later, I was contacted by Eric Turquin, who said that the pendant of this picture had come down a different line of the family that had sold the Abduction of Europa. This painting, and he sent me an image, and also very dirty, interestingly in the same very beautiful frame. And I thought, the pendant, could it be a pendant? And of course a dealer or an expert or an auctioneer would want you to, think it's the pendant and have the gallery go after it. So I was a little skeptical at first, but thought, it was entirely possible the scale was the same, the frames were matching, took it to my deputy director, and he showed it to the director, and they weren't as excited by this image. It's an interior, it sort of just wasn't, it didn't grab them the way the previous one has. And then, of course, as a lover of the 18th century, I made a special plug for the whole practice of collecting pendants and commissioning pendants and hanging pendants. Really, they were central to the 18th century aesthetic. But to no avail. So it came to auction and was actually bought by someone that Etienne knew. And so we contacted the new owner of this picture and asked him if we could have it at the gallery in order to clean it by the same hand, by Michael, so that for posterity, whatever happens to this picture, if we were convinced that it was a pendant, that they would live, in the same state. So Michael had it, and this is the pre-conservation slide. I think there's a slide of them together. Part of the deal was that we would clean the Venus and Psyche and then have it on long-term loan for a year. So it was kind of a quid pro quo. And during that period, we spent a lot of time thinking about this whole issue of pendants. And the expert at the gallery in 18th century French paintings is Yuriko Jakal. She did a lot of research and sort of thinking back and forth. We talked about it with groups of people, this whole issue, because it is just such an interesting issue. So the Abduction of Europa comes from Ovid. And it's about a god who goes into, does a kind of shape change because he falls in love with a mortal princess. And so it's Jupiter, and he transforms himself into a gorgeous white bull. And Europa and all of her maids fall in love with him and start petting him and cooing with him and teasing him. And then Europa is seduced onto his back, and kablam, he's off with her for Crete. And they procreate 3 times. The Venus and Psyche is also a story, actually from a different literary source, so from Apuleius's Golden Ass, about a god who shape changes, disappears in the day, and comes only in the night to his beloved mortal Psyche. And sort of exterior light, interior light, I mean, there was enough of a contrast, but similarity that you can imagine an educated group of saloniers hanging out with these 2 beautiful pictures hanging on either side of a fireplace, you know, quizzing each other and discussing the differences and the similarities and showing off their literary knowledge and their level of education. So we did decide ultimately that, yes, they are pendants, but in fact, Cupid and Psyche has gone back to his owner. One day, you never know. As long as it's in private hands, it may eventually come back into public hands.
Right.
But
I think there's so many interesting parts of your story, but something that sticks out to me is kind of the network of sociability that you kind of enacted when working on this acquisition. You know, Etienne Breton, Christophe Laribeau, your colleague Yuriko, and how it kind of became this, you know, this team effort in a way. And I think that's something very interesting. And if you think back to notions of connoisseurship in the 18th century, it's very similar. It's these groups of people having discussions and et cetera. And it's still very much the practice.
well, and all of them, of course, and this sounds a little trite, but all of them fueled by art passion.
Exactly.
That's what's bringing you together, and everybody's excited, and you're all sort of swooning, you know, as a group.
Right.
These things and trying to, you know, figure them out.
I think it's also fascinating that you had the same restorer work on both of them, because it makes a huge difference when pendants are separated. Usually the frames are lost, and one restored one way, another painting restored another, and so they end up not matching again, and that's a very clever, lucky thing to be able to do. Yeah.
It was a nice thing.
That's great. So, Jon, I thought I might ask you a question. We were just talking about how, Mary was talking about how institutions work, and so you are a private collector, and you have the privilege of working, you know, in relative autonomy. And so I want to ask you, what are the types of questions that you ask yourself when you're considering, you know, adding something to your collection?
Well, you know, the first thing is when presented with a painting or an object is ultimately is, do I love this? Because if you don't, then all the follow-up questions are just data, you know. But assuming that you love it, then you want to go through a process of, let's say with old master, an old master work, doing your best to confirm the attribution, having someone like Claire thoroughly analyze the condition of the piece, learning where the piece fits into the history of the artist, and then, you know, those are your green lights. You know, in other words, I've worked with many curator friends, and such as Mary, who generously advised me, and what I'm looking for is not do they agree with my assessment of the quality of the painting necessarily, but I'm looking for them to help me with a red light in case I'm in a danger zone here for one specific reason or another. Now, the way the process works is just sort of funny, because I was going to mention, you know, I met Claire when she came to our home because she was working on a show of the works of Barocci that was organized by Judy Mann at the St. Louis Museum of Art. And I have a brooch, and it's always been under glass. It's a small head of St. Francis, a gorgeous thing. And but Claire, so she came to examine it with regard to it being in the show, takes it out from under the glass, and I spend a half an hour with her discussing the piece, pretty much stroke by stroke. And this is, you know, tremendously enlightening, and part of what you want to be able to do to better understand works you're trying to acquire and works that you already own. Jack and I have known each other forever. We haven't done. I never bought a painting from him, despite the fact that he's so. I'm getting to that. He's incredibly knowledgeable, and also just, as you can tell, a very charming self. And but our tastes are different, and I, like Mary here, am a great lover of Courbet, to the point where my wife Barbara and I have, you know, 12 or 13, I haven't counted them lately, but 12 or 13 paintings mine. So Jack gets in Courbet, and he gives me a call because he knows that's one thing. And I come down, Courbet, if you have a Courbet, I live in Westchester, if you have a Courbet in New York, and I'm alerted to it by email, smoke signal, doesn't matter, I will be at your place of business in an hour. And I don't like them slipping through my hands. And Jack had a beautiful portrait of a woman with incredible brown hair, and you know, so that's just something you buy on site. You know, I mean, I don't have to go through that particular process as rigorously as I might with an artist I know less well. And then Mary here, I first met when she was organizing the Great Courbet Landscape Show when she was at the Getty Museum. And this was an incredible exhibition. And it went to, I think, to Houston and to Baltimore. But I saw it at all venues because I had some paintings in it. But Mary is to a private collector like myself, is a teacher. And our schedules overlapped 2 years ago, and there were 2 shows going on in Switzerland, one in Geneva and the other one was in Basel. And Mary was making what she calls a strategic, what do you call it? A surgical strike. She was flying in for one day to see these 2 shows, and then flying back. And I was traveling around with one of my artists who was on tour. And anyway, we had a day where we started at one of the places and then took a train to the other, and had a very satisfying day looking at maybe 150 Courbets. And looking with someone, another set of intelligent eyes, especially if they're more intelligent than your own, is one of the greatest ways to learn, is just looking together and being able to have a dialogue about what the one person is seeing and the other person is seeing, because, you know, just the free flow of responses is always enlightening.
Yeah. Can I just pile on to that idea?
Yes.
Because what Jon is talking about is, I think we would call it visual intelligence. Yes. But I was thinking about this panel on the train up this morning, and I would have to say that the most pleasurable aspect of my job as a curator is standing in front of an object with someone, and it doesn't even have to be an expert, it's heightened if it's an expert, looking together and talking and having this incredible experience of having that object open up. And many times I've approached an object, been a little bit cold to it, engaged with somebody. I mean, that's what these fairs are about. It's so much fun. And as we're talking, that object is opening up and warming up to me, or I am warming up to it. And these fairs, I was just going to say why I love going to Maastricht so much, which I call the Hothouse of Connoisseurship. You get out there in Maastricht, it's a little bit more comfortable in New York City, but in Maastricht, you are trapped out there.
You're stranded.
You're
right?
stranded in this gigantic Mats, what is it? It's a conference center. Yeah, it's gigantic. And all you're doing is looking intently in stands and then stepping out into these aisles, which are like traffic ways, filled with colleagues, dealers, collectors, and curators, coming upon them and discussing intently what you just saw. And that's 24/7, that's all that goes on there. And it's just this frenzy of this pleasure of connoisseurship. It's fantastic.
And I think, Jon, you made so many interesting remarks, but I think the idea of looking and looking and looking and looking is what is important, and that is how you learn. And I'm a teacher, and you would be surprised, graduate students, lots of graduate students don't go to the object, and it's so important what you learn when confronted with the actual object.
Because you can't read a book.
No.
You have to look.
Well, I, like Jack, got through a good part of my life with no interest in art, and through some, serendipitous occurrences, suddenly it sort of opened up to me, and from that point on, I am a looker. This is after my family and my work. This is what I do. And my work has been fantastic over the many years because it involves so much travel, and so I am able to look and relook at many of the greatest, and some, Munich. Mr. Springsteen plays Munich every 2 years, every 3 years. Munich has two of the greatest museums of old master work, one a sculptural museum, the other the Alta Pinacoteca painting museum, that are actually very little known or talked about, that are so phenomenal. And it was closed for 5 years for a renovation, and I finally it reopened, and I was so thrilled because they basically put it was a structural renovation. So when it reopened, it was exactly the same as it had been. The building was a very old building, and every painting was put back exactly where it was. And I said, oh, wow, this is, as opposed to just redoing the thing. Looking, that's been my education, that's the key to everything. It's visual art.
Absolutely. Well, we're so lucky to have Claire here today as really, truly one of the best conservators in this country, if not the world, truly. That's not a hyperbole. And Claire, your approach to connoisseurship necessarily involves science, and you are expertly trained. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the really spectacular acquisition that the Kimbell made of the early Michelangelo several years ago. And I'm going to pass, you have a few really interesting slides. I'm going to pass this over to you so you can advance it.
Thank you, Esther, and it's such a privilege to be on the panel with all of you. Very honored. This is the Torment of St Anthony by Michelangelo, and it's a painting that is currently about to be on view at the Met in the Michelangelo Drawing Show. So for those of you who don't know the painting, I hope you'll see it. that looks to be a spectacular show of drawings that was organized by Carmen Bombach, opening November 13th. The story about this painting is that it was sold at auction in London in 2008 as Workshop of Jon Landau. And there we go. This is a painting that was well known in Michelangelo's biography. It was written about by both Condivi and Vasari, that when he was a young boy of 12 or 13 years old, his friend, the artist Granacci, who was then working in Jon Landau's workshop, gave the young Michelangelo this print by Schongauer, a panel, some paints, and some drawings by Jon Landau, and encouraged him to copy it. It is not a direct copy. The scale of the painting and the print are very different. You'll be able to see that at the show at the Met, where this painting will hang side by side with a fantastic impression of the Schongauer print that comes from the National Gallery. I've learned so much from looking at that and hope to spend more time. So Michelangelo made critical changes in the way the figures were spaced, the negative space, the way they connect, and obviously he added this whole landscape at the bottom. The painting was actually cleaned. It was acquired by Adam Williams at Sotheby's in London, and he was given an export license, I think pretty readily, because English conservators and art historians had already looked at the painting and pretty much decided it was workshopped by Jon Landau. So Adam got it out of the country with no problem, and he took it to the Met, where it was cleaned by Michael Gallagher, actually. Here's 2 images of the painting before and after cleaning. And what I've learned in my years as a conservator, especially from the time that I was trained at the Met under John Brealey, is that the cleaning of an old master painting is a watershed moment in the life of a painting. And it's often a moment of real reevaluation. And especially at the Met in those days, and then later when I started working at the Kimbell with director Ted Pillsbury and Bill Jordan, and to the present day, this is a moment when you want to get all the experts you can in front of the painting. And certainly, I think that's what happened with the Michelangelo. Just by being at the Met, you had, Keith Christensen looking at the painting as Michael was cleaning it. You had the very talented paintings conservation staff at the Met examining it. They did the technical imaging, infrared, X-radiography. They did pigment analysis. I'm just showing you 2 details of the colors that emerged with cleaning. Of course, the young Michelangelo had to imagine how a black and white print could be converted into a color image. And I've always found the paintings don't lie when you put them under the microscope. There's also a quality of execution, I think, that was quite evident. Here's a photograph of Michael in the Met with the painting. The Met had first refusal, obviously, for the painting, and we at the Kimbell became aware of it and asked if we could be in line if for some reason the Met turned it down, which is what happened. I'm just going to show you a couple of technical images. This is an X-radiograph of the painting, which shows it's on poplar panel. You can see it has several wormholes. They've been filled with a lead-based putty. You can see that the artist added this imprimatura containing lead white in these horizontal strokes, but he saved space in the middle, knowing where certain figures were going to be. Also, you could see in the X-radiograph that he went back almost obsessively and corrected contours throughout the painting, and I hope you can see that in those 2 details on the right. We could also see areas where he had scraped back the paint, for example, along the back of this spiny fish demon. And here's 2 details showing some of these corrections where he would come back with the light background color and correct the contours. You see that throughout the painting. Also, curious thing that we could see in the X-radiograph in the lower left, there were these parallel scratches, something, probably metal point, that the artist has scratched through the imprimatura, which kind of makes more sense later. Infrared reflectography, which you see here on the left, was very informative and showed a series of pentimenti, which suggested to us that this is not a copy. And this has been published by Keith Christensen and Michael Gallagher. But for example, the club of the Spiny Demon, Spiny Fish Demon, was originally sketched with a brown brush outlines in the same position as we see in the Schongauer print on the left. but at the moment of painting, Michelangelo converts it to a firebrand and tilts it in a more vertical position. Sorry. And by the same token, initially the tail of that very long tail of the spiny fish demon was in a much wider arc, and it crossed over with the horn of another demon as seen in the Schongauer print. But then I think when Michelangelo decided to add this landscape at the bottom, he ran out of room when he introduced this big rounded rock. And so he had to come up with a reconfiguration of the tail, the horn, and so on. And he brings those two parallel horns closer together. He has the demon now biting one, which you don't see in the Schongauer. And he creates this wonderful, I think, sense of tension between the tip of the tail, the tip of the horn, and that head, those headdress, I don't know what to call it, where none of the elements exactly touch. There's this great tension. And it did make me think of the Sistine ceiling and the hand of God and the hand of Adam. The landscape which was added, I think after Michelangelo had finished the brush outlines of the main figures, and in fact he had outlined the rocks in the lower right following Schongauer's example, but then he abandons that idea. I think then he applies an imprimatura over the brush outlines, which will seal them and enable him to still reference them as he paints. But then on top of that imprimatura, which is like the first layer of paint, he gets out his metal point, and I think he starts scribbling and scratching, coming up with his first ideas for a river valley and these jagged mountainous rocks in the left. Also, I think he's really thinking through the narrative at this point, rethinking the narrative, because he adds in the crevice, the dark crevice of those mountainous rocks, he adds a little fire, and I'll show you maybe a better detail in a moment. And notice how he adds the burnt tree down there. I think that's the source of the firebrand that he adds at the top. So I'm speculating that the decision to add this landscape is what set a lot of these pentimenti in motion. Here's the little fire. It's a tiny little detail, but it's there. And he also adds shooting flames from the mouth of one of the demons. Again, none of that was in the Schongauer, and you think of St. Anthony's fire, and maybe someone here could even shed more light on that. But there was one part of the infrared reflectogram mosaic that I could not interpret. I felt I could explain everything else, but there was evidence of a doodle, a brush doodle in the lower left, in the area of the rocks, where otherwise there was just a lot of very fine metal hatching. So we called upon our good friend John Delaney, a conservation scientist at the National Gallery, who has a hyperspectral camera. And that camera is able to pull information out of paintings that is amazing, that an infrared camera will not be able to isolate. And I said, John, there's something going on down here. If you can make this clear, it would be great. So a few months later, I get this, and sure enough, they were able to clarify what the doodle consisted of. On the right, it's a compositional sketch, but it has nothing to do with our Michelangelo. It's figures in a room, and there's a foreshortened coffered ceiling. And so what was it? Well, my very clever administrative assistant, Rafael Barrientos Martinez, who's now pursuing a PhD at UCLA, figured it out. It's a compositional sketch for the Birth of the Baptist fresco by Ghirlandaio from the Tornabuoni Chapel. Now, once we made this connection, the next person I called on was Jean Cadogan, the great Ghirlandaio scholar, and she pointed out that of all the frescoes in the Tornabuoni Chapel, this one can be firmly dated to coincide with the birth of Tornabuoni's grandson on October 11th, 1487. And she said, it confirms the chronology of your painting, because we know that the young Michelangelo had just joined the workshop, not as an apprentice yet, but as an errand boy in May, June of 1487. So we feel like this is sort of smoking gun evidence to confirm the attribution of our painting. And I was very pleased to see at the Met that they're going to include this sketch right on the label in the galleries. But I also want to make the point that this is a painting that it took courage for the Kimbell to buy, even though we've done our homework, and certainly it had been vetted by no less than Keith Christensen and Michael Gallagher and all of the people at the Met. But still, we bought it knowing that there were many people who did not believe in the attribution. And, something, again, that I think I learned from my early years at the Met is that, you always, especially during the cleaning, during the reevaluation of a painting, you continue to bring in scholars to assess it. And that's a process that continued at the Met, at the Kimbell, long after we bought the painting. And my experience as a conservator has taught me that when a painting is by a great artist, with, it continues to give you information. It continues to talk to you. If it's a copy, it will cease being of interest. And conservators live with paintings. We live with them on our easels in our studios for weeks and months at a time. So we develop a very close relationship with these works of art. And it has been my experience that the Michelangelo continues to give more information. And
that's really interesting. And obviously you're relying so much on science and the incredible tools that you have at your fingertips, but you're also talking about trusting your instinct, and I think that's a real part of connoisseurship, and it's why it's a controversial subject matter. Is that it can be a little willy-nilly.
I think you have to trust in your instincts, but you have to trust in what the object is telling you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so do you mind passing back the changer?
Sorry.
So this is a great art detective story, the Michelangelo. I know, Jack, you've done some sleuthing in your past.
This painting came up at a small auction in Europe, and a friend of mine, a colleague, Otto Naumann, and I discovered this. And we had seen a show in Cleveland of the Head of Christ by Rembrandt. There was an exhibition, and in Rembrandt's studio, there are several paintings. This is the one that people think is probably by Rembrandt. It's in Berlin, of the same model. So clearly this model was in Rembrandt's studio, and Rembrandt had his pupils do various studies of this figure as Christ. But we saw this painting and we said, this is the same model, but it's the head of John the Baptist. So we speculated that this was also done in Rembrandt's studio, but it's the only head of John the Baptist. So quite a clever student would have turned the model on his side and done this painting. So we did had some scientific technological studies done, and found out, first of all, that it had been expanded. It was exactly the same size as all the other panels when you covered the expansion with the frame. The wood panel dated from the 1640s, exactly the same period as the other pictures. So we're not really sure who painted this. It's very close to Rembrandt, and Rembrandt may have had something to do with going over parts of the picture. It's hard to identify which student would have done this, but we know that it was done in his studio, and it was the same model. And it's fascinating just to find out the cleverness of changing that. Maybe you can't see the similarities exactly from this, but when you look at all these pictures, they are definitely the same figure, and this one cleverly changed the subject. And that's the only image that we know of this. But we sold it to a private collector, and it's on loan to a museum as School of Rembrandt. But who knows? This is a continuing saga.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. There's so much to discuss. So Claire, I'm going to ask you to power through. I really asked Claire if she would talk. I mean, it's so impressive to be able to have someone who can talk about Michelangelo and Caravaggio on the same panel. But Claire was instrumental in the Kimbell's acquisition in 1987, I believe, of this incredible painting. And this. The story behind this inspired the title for our panel today, Fingerprints in the Paint. So I'm going to power through, Claire.
Try to do this
okay.
quickly. More quickly than the Michelangelo.
It's going to be hard. But, yeah.
Okay. So the painting had been lost for 90 years when the Kimbell acquired it in 1987. Oh, where did that go? Okay. Next. Yeah, we knew it from this photograph on the right that was taken in 1896 called the Brown photograph. And, in 1987, we didn't have Photoshop then. Nowadays you could just overlay the two and say, it's the same painting. But Ted Pillsbury said, look at the brown photograph, tell me if it's the same painting, and look for incisions. You can see that the painting on the left, which you're seeing before cleaning, has an addition, similar to the brown photograph. We x-rayed it. It had a lead white ground, and so it made it really hard to see the image, though it did confirm where the top edge of the original top edge of the painting was. You could see the cusping, so we removed that addition. You can see what the color of the ground is in a few places where it's not covered, like under the nose of the cheat on the right. It's a beautiful, pearly, light gray ground, similar to Caravaggio's early, which he used in his early period when he first arrived in Rome, and it gives the painting great luminosity. This is the infrared mosaic, again, which is very informative. We could see there was a very key pentimento in the lower right where Caravaggio repositioned the hand of the cheat, where he's pulling the card out of his waistband. We could also see some repositioning of the stripes on his jacket and other details. Here's a closer detail showing how he very rapidly blocks in the costume with that zigzag brushwork. And you can see the change in the hand. You could also see some tiny incisions in the fingernails. Again, he repositions the stripes in the costume. You can see the really rapid blocking in. This is not something you would expect to see in a copy. He makes little changes even in the hand on the table. He paints the entire gloved hand of the older cheat before he covers the tips of the fingers with the torso of the younger cheat, something you would not expect a copyist to do. And here come the fingerprints. When it came to that beautiful, soft, foliate pattern that he paints in the vest of the cheat, using that light blue paint, he then blots it with his fingers, and I hope you can see that on the right. And I love this. The painting in Sicily, the Adoration of the Shepherds, to create the buttons for Joseph's jacket, he simply, while the paint is still wet, he takes his finger and swirls around in the wet paint, exposing the dark brown ground and letting just a little bit of that cream-colored paint at the center be the highlight. And that's his technique for creating those buttons. And we found the same thing in our cheat. The tiny little button again on the older cheat's vest, where he swirled around in the wet paint, exposing that light gray ground, but letting the light color of the vest serve as the highlight. Paintings keep talking to you. I mean, we didn't see that until we'd owned it for years. This is something, it was painted at the same time as the fortune teller at the Capitoline. They're very closely related. They were both owned by Cardinal Del Monte. And when the lining, the old lining, was being removed from the Caravaggio at the Met, the remnants of the Cardinal Del Monte's wax seal was found on the reverse of the canvas. You see that on the left. And just by happenstance, Gisela Helmkamp, who worked at the Met at that time, knew from her friend who was the restorer at the Capitoline Museum that they had found remnants of Cardinal Del Monte's seal on the back of the fortune teller when that painting, when the old canvas, lining canvas, was removed from that painting. So we were able to trace our wax seal, send it to them, and they were a dead-on match. So this was the smoking gun evidence, again, that this was Cardinal. This was Caravaggio's painting.
You know, from a collector's point of view, the issue of attribution is incredibly complex, and my advice for collectors, including to myself, is you don't get through a lifetime of collecting without making, quote, mistakes. Attributions in your collection are not going to be 100% permanent because of what Claire is saying. The paintings continue to talk, and eventually information that may contradict the attribution that you acquired the object under comes forward. So, you know, you can't be intimidated by the attribution issue when you're collecting, and you do need to have some awareness that there's always tomorrow, and things happen. knowledge advances, you know.
I remember Sir John Pope Hennessy saying at the Met that if you're ever going to put together a really interesting collection, 10% of what you buy will be proved to be fake. But he said that's the only way you'll end up with a really interesting collection.
Well, so we are actually now running out of time, and we didn't get through all of our points, but I want to end with a question for everyone. So John, Mary, Jack, Claire, is connoisseurship a myth? I mean, what does it mean to have a good eye? Is that a real thing?
Connoisseurship is not a myth. It's a school of thought that is dismissive of it for all kinds of reasons. But the fact is, like anything else, and we go back to looking, the more you look, the more you study, the more information you obtain, the deeper the experience you can have, and your opinion becomes more valuable. When people say about art, well, you know, what different, you know, my opinion is as good as your opinion. Does anybody seriously think their opinion about the Caravaggio is as equally valid as Claire's opinion after the work that she has done on it? So connoisseurship, the deepening of the experience, the deepening of what you're able to see when you look through constant self-education or education with everyone else, is a goal. You know, my goal is to feel like I have some connoisseurship, you know, so that's my view.
That's beautiful, John. That is really good. I think John's point, which I would underline, is that connoisseurship is a practice and not sort of a God-given gift. And I think that where it gets into trouble and the bad rap that it's had is when it's used arbitrarily as a kind of false authority. And this whole concept of the eye, the fact that an eye is physical and that some people have it and others don't have it, I think is a myth and is used in not the most beneficent ways sometimes. Everybody can have an eye. It just takes work and commitment and passion. And you can
the more you look, the better you see.
Yeah.
And the more you look, the more you learn. If you're willing to learn, then you'll see more. And it's like if you go to exhibitions. If I go to see a show at a museum and I don't know very much about whatever that subject is, I'll take the acoustic guide because it'll slow me down and it'll actually make me look at something where I would just go past it. And that moment of time, it's like talking with friends at the museum. But if you have this voice, it used to be Philippe de Montebello, loving to listen to this, but it causes you to slow down, then to learn. And when you learn, then you see more. And then your vocabulary increases, and the more you know.
Acoustic guides, which I used to always avoid because they felt very simplistic. Yeah. The quality of the acoustic guides, the quality of information that is there is actually tremendous now, and I'm with you. I'm a
they also
user.
just slow me down, you know, because I rush.
And this process of listening and looking, that is a dynamic that can only happen in front of the object, listening and looking.
And so we are so fortunate to have this wonderful fair at our disposal with incredible pictures and works of decorative art and sculpture. And so I hope that you'll spend a lot of time looking today and to reflecting about how lucky we are to be able to enjoy incredible works of art. So thank you for having us, Linda.
And before I sign off, and we sign off from this segment, remember there's a wonderful jewelry coffee talk tomorrow, which I assure you is going to be of equally high quality. But I'd also like to ask Jack, what's your stand number?
It's 77, I think. Last time I looked, 77.
77 is Jack's stand, in case you want to stroll by there.
Nothing left, but...
He's happy to say. Thank you so much. Again, thanks so much to the Clark Art Institute for their help with this wonderful panel. I'd ask you please to leave as quickly as possible. The temptation to stay and chat is strong, but resist it. And please take as much of your own trash out as you can. Thank you.